Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you may be. On behalf of the Department of Law, Unhcr University, it is my utmost pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this evening's webinar. I would like to thank Professor Katerina Linos for agreeing to deliver this talk. I had the privilege of not only going through her PowerPoint slides, she was very kind to share her co-authored draft paper. As I understand, she is working on it, and it's an excellent paper already. And I look forward to seeing it in a published form, maybe in the near future. Now, if I may say a few words about the paper, as I understand it, maybe the 20th century was about the rise of traditional international institutions with the UN and many others. Maybe at the beginning of this century, particularly maybe dominated by the US and some other Western powers, there were many institutions which were not really institutions in traditional public international law sense of the term. This new generation of institutions had different features. They were more like networks or clubs. Maybe I could refer to the Financial Action Task Force, maybe G8, maybe G20, and many others. And also on the International Health Plan, there were some initiatives which were not just initiative of states, but initiative between states and other actors. However, as Professor Linos in her paper very eloquently shows, that maybe we are seeing some retreat to the traditional model. Maybe we are seeing that the arguable flaws or arguable causes for this type of new generation of networks or clubs between and among states, for the very reason for which they have started to emerge, maybe the idea is changing. Maybe the actors are realizing that if you have to work at a global level, you cannot just have networks. You need something more, not only for engendering greater cooperation, but maybe for other reasons, maybe for getting many actors within a state to cooperate, to get wider international acceptance. And there are also questions of the legitimacy of the institution. There are also questions about immunities of the institutions and also of their staff. With that brief note, I welcome once again Professor Linos. I, of course, look forward to the questions and comments from you, dear audience. Professor Linos, over to you.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here today. It's 7 in the morning in California, and I have never been to Bangladesh. So this invitation really allows me to travel not only to a different time zone, but to connect with ideas that I don't necessarily often hear about. I'll say a little bit about myself and my research and about my co-author, and then move on to the paper, which Professor Islam so helpfully previewed. So my name is Katerina Linos. I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and my co-author is Professor Christina Dagirdas at the University of Michigan. We are both professors at law schools, but what distinguishes American academia from legal academia in many other countries is that the work we do is often interdisciplinary. So we use empirical methods. We worry whether the law in practice is anything like the law on the books. My own work, I grew up in Greece, so my own work is very much influenced by international organizations. When I was growing up, the European Union loomed very large, and it still does. I came to the US and have studied a number of problems that international organizations are intended to solve. Most recently, I've been working on questions of refugees, how it is that countries neighboring refugee situations end up hosting a disproportionate number of people without necessarily the financial and material support of the international community. So I've worked a little bit on the Syrian crisis, on the Ukrainian crisis, a little bit on the Rohingya situation. So those are issues that international organizations like UNHCR, featured on this slide here, are meant to address, but which are not fully addressed, I think. For a brief bio, I think you can click on the link here, but let me close that box and just say that it's my distinct pleasure kind of in day-to-day life, in addition to my research, to teach a lot of LLM students. So at Berkeley, we have a lot of American students and also Chinese students for a reason who come in degree in law, but then we offer a master's in law, which is truly international. Although we have many students from India, China, Korea, we don't have that many students from Bangladesh. So that's not an opportunity that I just don't know that much and would love to learn more. So let me come back to this point that the 20th century celebrated international organizations. After the Second World War, we built a number of agencies. On these slides, we see a stamp celebrating 60 years of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We also see kind of centrally featured here a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the World Health Organization. And to my right, a celebration on an Indian slide of the Food and Agriculture Organization. I think this is a 40th celebration. We thought after the ravages of World War II that it would be better to work together, it would be better to negotiate, it would be better to set up programs that had a physical presence around the world to address some of the shared challenges, some of the externalities. And these organizations are still very active today. These organizations don't disappear, unlike, for example, corporations, which enter into bankruptcy and no longer exist after some point. International organizations are very much alive despite significant criticism. But many states, many powerful states at the beginning of the 21st century, and here I mean the US and the Europeans in particular, some Australians, OECD countries, were not happy with traditional international organizations, both for legitimate reasons and for illegitimate reasons. One frustration, for example, with the World Health Organization in the early 2000s was that major diseases that could have been addressed, so the AIDS crisis, tuberculosis, malaria, were being addressed far too slowly, that the World Health Organization was talking too much and doing too little, that the World Health Organization had rejected partners like pharmaceutical companies because physicians were very skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, and that it would be better to set up a nimbler, more agile force. So not have these bureaucrats from the UN, but McKinsey consultants could do the job just so much better with the same amount of money. So that's the positive case for setting up networks. Another reason, which was certainly implicit in these conversations, was that the United Nations and organizations formed in that vein allowed developing states far too much power. So rich countries were frustrated with the time bureaucracies took to solve problems, and also with the fact that they were outvoted systematically. And they said, we'll just set up a parallel system and funnel our money, not through the World Health Organization, but through this new body, the fund for, the Global Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. And we're going to just do this work much more efficiently without all this debate. We're going to bring in the pharmaceutical companies, we're going to bring in the major private funders. This idea in international organization of one state, one vote, we don't like at all. So we'll have a 20-member vote that's structured much more like a business, and this is how we're going to make progress. This idea in the early 20th century of networks, of the early 21st century of networks, of coalitions of the willing. If you want, you can join us. If you don't want to partner with us, that's fine. We see in many different types of issue areas. I've mentioned healthcare. The most notorious, of course, was security. The US promoted a coalition of the willing to fight the Second Iraq War because of a false belief of weapons of mass destruction. We had set up networks in financial regulation. The thought was that you don't need every country in the world to be making decisions on the financial stability system. All of the money is concentrated in the 8 biggest economies. You can just get some informal cooperation between treasuries and between banking regulators and set up these really powerful networks that can organize the world of finance, blacklist countries, figure out how to fight money laundering, and do all of this without a lot of interference. This was kind of the hope in the US in the early 2000s, and Europeans went along with this. A lot of networks were built. We draw a lot on the work of Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was critical in the Clinton administration, but this was something that the first Bush administration, the second Bush administration, the Trump administration, we had a lot of bipartisan support here in the US, even if the initial, some of the initial thinking was by centrist Republican administrations. What my co-author Christina Daggerdas and I are doing is looking at how well this worked. We're saying all of this was established in the early 2000s. There were many promises made. There were promises that these networks would be agile and flexible, that they would solve problems much more rapidly than outdated bureaucracies. Have those promises been realized? What has happened in the 2 ensuing decades? And we have 2 main arguments. One is purely descriptive. Our first claim is to track the most prominent and celebrated of networks and to say that people no longer believe that networks once can do this kind of work. And we know this by looking not both at their statements and at their actions. So we look at those networks and say, look, on the ground, these organizations that were small and nimble now have much broader membership. Many more countries are seen as essential participants. And informality, which was seen as a key advantage, is no longer seen that way. Descriptively, there are secretariats. The idea that secretariats were not necessary because member states, ministers could come together and decide on what to do, that doesn't seem to be widely believed. So our first claim is descriptive. We will go through some statistics. We will go through some examples just to say the world is different 20 years in, and the optimism we had about networks is not borne out by the data. The second claim we make is an explanation. Why is it the case that international organizations have this persistent appeal? Now, we are building on a very large literature. This is a question in international law that many others have asked before. So I'll start before making our argument by briefly introducing what people already know or think about international organizations. So why do we build international organizations rather than solving problems country by country or coming together informally as crises necessitate to do this? What are the advantages of international organizations? One set of advantages has to do with problems that have externalities, global problems. COVID is such a problem. The thought is that if one country mishandles the initial stages of an epidemic, it becomes a global pandemic. So it makes much more sense to help a neighboring country initially than not to do this, even if You only care about the welfare of the citizens of your own country. So climate change is a paradigmatic problem here as well. It doesn't make sense to tackle it alone. Every effort you do to make your own businesses pollute less might just be kind of a drop in the bucket, nothing at all in terms of its size. It might be that those same businesses will move to a neighboring state because we all live on the same planet, we need to coordinate. So this is a traditional understanding of the benefits of international organization, where there are externalities, there are advantages to cooperation, and these advantages are significant. Sometimes, however, as with climate change, we face very severe collective action problems. Nobody wants to take the lead. Another main advantage of international organizations is thought to be their neutrality. The idea here is that you don't let the kids cut up the cake. You have an adult in the room who says, you need to cut it up in eighths. So having somebody tell countries fighting over a border, hey, like, this is where the border will be, makes it more politically palatable for leaders from both states to tolerate some losses and not fight a war over the border. So neutrality in the allocation of shared resources, the need to create shared resources, these are well understood reasons for international organizations. There are also some well understood pathologies of international organizations. So the criticisms that the US and the EU had of the UN were shared by other people and governments. In particular, there's a set of criticisms surrounding bureaucracies. So bureaucracies depoliticize issues. They make political issues appear neutral. They apply the same solution to all comers, regardless of whether it is the optimal solution. So the idea would be that there's a financial crisis, the IMF comes in and calls for austerity, whether or not you're in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, it's the same remedy. And people are frustrated sometimes that there isn't a tailored solution, that people from a foreign country that have no idea of local context are just coming and imposing a cookie cutter solution. This is a well understood problem with international organizations. There are many more. What we are saying is that we recognize these problems and advantages of international organizations, but we want to add a key thought. When you're building an international organization from scratch in 1945, in 1900, you can do whatever design you want. But if you're building something in a world that has a lot of international organizations and a lot of people who are familiar with the international organization structure, it might just be easier to persuade people to go with a familiar form than with an innovative form. The idea here is that if I'm trying to persuade you to buy a product, if I tell you, look, it's very, very similar to what you already have, it's just an upgrade, it's something you know how it works, there's no hidden agenda here, you might be much more comfortable than if I am trying to introduce something completely new, especially if you're already suspicious that I am coming from abroad, that I have in the past misbehaved, that I have in the past tried to sell ideas that are not what is promised. So our second claim is that international organizations need to appeal to very diverse audiences. You need to persuade health ministers, you need to persuade foreign ministers, you need to persuade trade officials, you need to persuade people in rich countries and poor countries, you need to persuade not only states, but other international organizations, you need to persuade potential employees. So if you just go with something that is familiar, then that is more likely to succeed. Let me give an example here. The Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank was a body that the Americans strongly opposed and that the Chinese wanted. And it was promoted in exactly this way. Like, look, Americans, you have no reason to oppose this because it looks exactly like the World Bank. It looks exactly like the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. If you believe in these institutions, you can't oppose this new institution. We're not doing anything weird here. It will just have a different geographic focus. And of course, this was established over the objections of American administrations, but this is kind of how an argument that often resonates with diverse audiences. Let me, I'm checking the chat. I can keep on going, but also if people want to interrupt at any point to ask any kind of question, however basic or descriptive or theoretical, I'm always eager. So our two claims are, we set up all these networks, and 20 years in, many of them have formalized. And the reason for this is that they were set up in a world that was already full of international organizations. And it was just easier in this world to build organizations that looked like existing structures. So I'm going to define some terms. This is often kind of the first thing one does in a paper, and it's particularly important, not so much for international organizations, but for networks. So let me start by talking about what is an international organization. Here, the literature in both law and political science is quite clear. So this part of the talk, if you ever were, going on an exam, like this part of the talk, you can just, it's material that you should know. It's not our ideas, except in that we're clarifying them. So any textbook definition of an international organization says that you need one or more states to come together. So these are not, Coca-Cola is not an international organization. The Catholic Church is not an international organization, even though they have a global presence, because their constituent units are not sovereign states. So the constituent units of sovereign states are, the constituent units of international organizations are sovereign states, and you need maybe two of them to have an international organization. We talk in international law about bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties, so agreements between states that differ on whether they're agreements between two states or many states, but you need states as the building blocks. What are states? They are 193 countries that are members of the United Nations. There's a separate definition of state in international law that is, again, very well established. You need control of your territory, permanent population, and to be recognized by others as a state. That's the controversial part. So an international organization has states as members. An international organization is kind of an independent entity. So that's kind of the second element. So a bilateral agreement between the US and Bangladesh, in which the US promises to deliver weapons in exchange for money, that's not an international organization. That is a treaty or some kind of contract. And the reason why is because we don't set up an independent secretariat body that has its will of its own. So first you need membership made of states, and then you need something else. The UN Secretariat, the European Commission, the FATF Secretariat, the UNHCR people, the UNDP, all of that is essential to the definition of an international organization and essential to the literature on these issues. Member states are very worried that you set up a civil service, and that civil service is multinational. That civil service is independent in practice and in theory from what member states are supposed to do, and they do things that states don't like. They are more international. They don't pay enough attention to budget. But those are kind of the core elements of an international organization. You need states as members, you need an independent secretariat. And finally, under international law, international organizations get some extraordinary privileges, immunities, and capacities. So if you want to sue an international organization because, for example, UN peacekeepers brought cholera to Haiti, you can't do that. You try to bring them in a court, and the court says, I'm so sorry, we have these doctrines of immunity that are very comprehensive, and the money of the UN is shielded from any kind of lawsuit. if you want to sue a UN diplomat because they, I don't know, because they parked too much. There are all these parking tickets in New York at the time of the General Assembly, and the people of New York are very upset that all these diplomats are parking and not paying the parking tickets. Again, kind of the individuals have immunity. And of course, it's not really the parking that's the problem. It is all kinds of other misconduct that is basically immune from scrutiny. In addition, there are all kinds of civil service perks in the UN. So if any of you are thinking about sitting for the UN exam, let me just tell you that this is a, this is a good career. I saw a question about the Rohingya crisis. I'll come to it in just a second. I'll just say your salary is going to be high because it's matched to the US civil service. Your salary is not going to be taxed. Like this is, a huge perk. And there are all kinds of other allowances for travel, for kids' education outside of country. It's a really cushy job. So that's kind of what an international organization is. A paradigmatic international organization is all the international organizations you've heard of. So whereas theoretically you can have an international organization with 3 countries, and there are many, many of those descriptively. If you have the UN, the WHO, the IMF in mind, those have very broad membership. The opposite of this we call a network. So a network can have participants in it that are not states. A network can have a flexible board. A network can have the Gates Foundation as a board member. A network is also defined by its informality. So you might not need the staff that can, get all of these perks and do stuff that was not intended because it doesn't have a permanent instance. And because it doesn't have this instantiation, it also doesn't have these extraordinary legal privileges and immunities. I want to look very briefly at the question in the chat in case it makes sense to answer it now. So the advantages, as a developing country, it's become very difficult for a government to cope with giving up refugees. Yes. Yes. Okay. So I'll talk about, I saw 2 elements in Fahmed's question. One is that it is very, very difficult for any country to handle a mass influx of refugees without support. That refugees don't have a right to travel to any country they want, but there is an obligation called non-refoulement not to turn them away once they arrive. So that's a huge problem. And also that kind of global attention has shifted away from this issue to the Ukraine. So right now, all of the money is going to the Ukrainian displaced people. And these 4 million people are treated very, very differently than other displaced people. And the amount of money and attention given to Ukrainians is just extraordinary. So I will turn to that question a little bit later, but I definitely agree with the premise. In 2018, there was the Global Compact on Migration, where people came to the UN and said, we need to do something about it. But what was done was that kind of a collection basket was passed around, and countries said, hey, let's help out Bangladesh, let's help out Tanzania, let's help out Rwanda, let's help out Kenya, let's help out some of these countries that are hosting Turkey, very large numbers of refugees, but we don't have a real structure to move people to other countries, to compensate countries for the real amount. So I definitely think this is a global problem, and also agree that since February of 2002, all kinds of global problems have been put on the back burner in order to prioritize the war in Ukraine and the consequences of that war. So that's absolutely right. Let me continue and talk a little bit about some examples. What am I talking about? And let me talk about some networks that were celebrated and what they look like. So an example of a pure network is the G20 or the G7 or the G8 when Russia was on the a member and recognized differently. So what these are conferences of heads of state, finance ministers. They come together They try to coordinate at the most general level. For example, they would say, look, inflation is going to be a huge problem for all of us. How can we stop beggar thy neighbor policies in which the US increases interest rates, and this has devastating consequences for the rest of the world? How can we coordinate on COVID? What does it mean if we all close our borders at the same time? This is still happening. This is very informal. We have some quotations from the Russians that speak to this, right? So Foreign Minister Lavrov said, like, you can't kick us out of the G8 because it's not a thing. Like, there's no club there. So, you don't want us, you call it the G7, you can't do anything. So contrary to the efforts made kind of in the UN to censure Russia and say kind of like, look, Russia's not playing by the rules, in the G20 and the G8, now G7, like, there were no rules. You come together if you feel like coming together, you don't otherwise. So this is the example of a network that was a network and is still a network. But I'm now going to give an example of medium formalization and an example of strong formalization. In the area of financial regulation, we have many celebrated networks. So in the paper, we start with the Financial Action Task Force, whose core goal is to stop money laundering. We also have IOSCO, whose goal is to make sure that securities laws, so laws that protect investors, once they have put in money in some company, are protected. We have something called the Basel Agreement, which concerns central banks. All of those were set up informally. It is a little shocking that we set up informal institutions that have huge influence over your day-to-day life. So whether you can take out a loan out of your bank will depend very much on what the rules are for whether that bank needs to have a lot of assets to back up that loan. So if it needs to keep, 2% versus 8% of its current obligations in reserve, is going to mean that it's either going to be very conservative with its lending, or it's going to allow for a lot of risk and a lot of rapid growth and perhaps rapid decline. Those rules are set not at the UN, not through negotiation. There's no one from Bangladesh that really participated in those conversations. Instead, the thought was, you can just get 8 people in the room, figure out what the rules are, and make sure that everyone else just accepts the rules. That is no longer the belief. The belief after for the US, September 11th was this watershed moment. We realized that we just don't have control to the extent we think we do, and we need a lot of cooperation in order to pursue our goals, which are to stop terrorist finance, which are to make sure money laundering is limited. So we needed China and Russia to be on board, and we needed very small countries, the Yemens and the Somalias of this country, to also help out. Countries that the Security Council countries were quickly made members of these organizations, and support was sought to support these resolutions through the UN. So IOSCO, coming back to this example, now is not a pure network. It's incorporated under Canadian law, but it has much broader membership, and it has a secretariat so that the US can't just agree with the UK and the French and just say this is the global rule. The Egmont Group is again kind of a network that deals with financial intelligence, and it has a true treaty, an agreement between states. It looks exactly like an international organization today, whereas it didn't a couple of decades ago. These examples we want to systematize, because when you're a lawyer, people will say, well, like, there are examples, and I can think of counter examples, and who knows whether you cherry-picked examples that fit your argument. So what my co-author Christina Dargadas and I, with the help of some fabulous students here at Berkeley, did, we said, like, let's just take the organizations that were most celebrated in the early 2000s and study all of them. So we took the celebrated book by Anne Marie Slaughter, and we said, let's look at issue by issue what these organizations look like. So we have an appendix which says exactly kind of what their law is. It looks a lot like a legal article, but here we're just presenting it with green ticks. Yes, it expanded. No, it did not expand. Yes, it had a secretariat. No, it does not have a secretariat. Yes, there's immunity. No, there's not. So I'll look first at the financial and insurance regulators in the world. All of them now have expanded very dramatically. So it's not that they went from like 10 to 11 members. They have expanded from a dozen members to over 100 members, and all of them have a secretariat. For those of you who are wondering how this is done technically, we did a lot of interviews with the legal counsels, and the way it's done is a little parasitic. So the Financial Action Task Force is parasitic on the OECD. So the members, the employees of the Financial Action Task Force are technically employees of the OECD. They have the same salary scales, they have the same employment resolution mechanisms for disputes, they have the same kinds of benefits. So that's how the Secretariat was given all kinds of immunities that it would otherwise not have. So if you want to sue a member of the Financial Action Task Force because you're also an employee there and you were discriminated against, you're going to have a lot of problems associated with immunity that are specific to international organizations or to diplomats that you wouldn't otherwise have. However, we haven't seen in these organizations immunity for protecting the assets of the organization, but also they don't have a lot of assets, so it's not essential. So they don't have, they set rules with huge impact, but they don't have money. When it comes to other economic cooperation bodies like APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, or the International Competition Network, which sets the antitrust rules, again, we see geographic expansion and an independent secretariat. When it comes to groups that are focused on law enforcement, like Interpol or the Egmont Group, we see even more formalization. So we see both organizational immunity and staff immunity. And when we see other kinds of organizations like the OSCE, an organization that's supposed to bring cooperation from the eastern and western parts of Europe, we see the problems associated with informality. At the very bottom, I have the G7 and the G20, organizations where we don't see these trends, organizations that are not properly called organizations, they're true networks. Let me give some examples to say why it is that the network form had some problems. So we say international organizations must be responsive to three audiences: to other states, to other international organizations, and to their staff. And the traditional model resonates in some ways. So I'll start with staff because that's the easiest thing. So one of the lawyers for the Global Fund said, look, every time I tell my colleagues your salary could be untaxed if we change format, they perk up. It's not a hard sell. Like, we haven't gotten around to doing it because it's really hard to change things. We have a lot of status quo ways, but staff tend to be very supportive of getting untaxed salaries, privileges and immunities. Participation in the UN pension fund is a big plus. So it's not hard to see why the traditional form appeals to staff. What is perhaps harder to see is why it would appeal to some member states. There are also very principled arguments for why international organization staff should have some of these privileges. One of these concerns the independence of key figures vis-a-vis the states that they're supposed to regulate. So we have at the beginning of the paper examples from FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and at the end of the paper, examples from the UN Security Council Ombudsman in review of sanctions. They basically say, if I'm supposed to tell Germany, you have problems with money laundering. If I'm supposed to tell the US, you have blacklisted someone without sufficient cause. So please don't blacklist them. I need some independence. I can't be the contractor. If I'm the contractor on a fixed term contract, I can't, I don't have the status necessary to carry out my job. So give me some security, not because I really need it in my person, but otherwise the goal you've set for me is unachievable. Let me move on to the second audience, other international organizations. Here, the argument is a little bit more technical. And the idea is that if you want to do a joint project, so if you want to put out a big loan, it is much easier if you are working with someone whose structure you completely understand. So let's say you want to give a big loan to fund a development project in Bangladesh, and you want to pull together 3 banks to finance this. If they all have exactly the same terms for the loans, exactly the same ethics codes, exactly the same compliance mechanisms and review, it's just much easier to say, you do a third, I do a third, the other bank does a third. We'll work really smoothly together. I'll bring another example when it comes. Let me take one brief moment and I'll be right back. Let me make one more example why it's easier to work with other international organizations, and here it will be the OSCE. The OSCE has a physical presence. It helps with elections. It helps with border security. It would really like to get from states weapons, tanks at a really easy, convenient way, the way states can share these assets with others that have similar forms, but it finds itself without the international organization protections needing to go through bidding processes that delay these projects, needing to pay 3 times as much for projects that for assets that would have been transferred or loaned for free because it is not an international organization. Finally, let me go to the hardest category. Why is it that other states would want an international organization membership? It's easy to see why states that were excluded by networks would want in. It's easy to see why a network form that prioritizes the interests of the West over the interests of the rest would be unappealing, and why countries that were excluded would want in. The hardest question is why a country like the US or like the EU that thought they could do it alone recognizes that we need Russia, we need China, we need Somalia. Here, some of the best arguments come from heads of organizations that did not have that kind of support. So we have some coming back to the Rohingya and to migration. There's now something called the International Organization for Migration. It now has Russia and China as members, but that wasn't the case earlier on. It was seen as a Western-dominated organization, and the head of the organization was always, an American, said, "I spent every single vacation trying to fly to Beijing and to Moscow to persuade them that they needed to be members." And the day, the UN said were the UN Migration Agency that really changed our status vis-a-vis other organizations, that really changed what we could do, that really meant that we could have much more influence globally. And kind of the puzzle is like, why does the UN, why would that happen? Why would the US want the countries that it had previously excluded? And I think the answer is that networks did not deliver. Without buy-in, without all of this work, you couldn't do it. Let me give, I won't give more examples now, but I'm more than happy to give more examples if asked. I'm going to conclude with a slide suggesting that the UN is at the top of a hierarchy despite lots and lots of criticism of this bureaucracy, that not all networks and international organizations are the same, that the ability of a very powerful network to gain observer status, for example, is something that was sought after. So let me end with that example. the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria has the same kind of budget as the WHO. They have more money than they can effectively channel. They were tasked with fighting these 3 diseases. Now they've been tasked with the COVAX program for vaccination. They have a lot of money, and they have a lot of goodwill. They're not a highly criticized body. However, they fought really hard for something called UN observer status. That doesn't seem like, it would be very valuable. Observer status sounds like, you go, you look, but it's not. For them, getting it meant that they could get much better access to the people they wanted access. They wanted to bring in vaccines in various parts of Africa, and they would find that some customs official would just say, like, I don't know what this is. You need to go through customs checks, and you need to, a 2-month delay. And they didn't have connections outside of the health ministry. And the health minister wasn't in charge of this. This was a trade minister. And by going to the UN, they were able to speak to the head of state. They were able to speak to the foreign minister. They were able to get everything they needed so that the vaccines, the bed nets, the money could be really easily transferred, and they could work kind of not with one-on-one with the ministry they were most familiar with, but with so many different agents. And that's why they actively pursued and succeeded in getting this. I'm not going to give more examples now, but I have more examples. Let me end here and open up to some questions.
Thank you, Professor Linos, for your excellent lecture. Let me raise a couple of questions. The first question that I would like to ask you is the examples that you have cited in your paper and also in your presentation, they focus on Western dominated networks. So could you think of any of these international networks driven by the Global South? If they are, what are those? If not, why not? Why are they mostly driven by the Western countries? Thank you. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. So to start with, the general pattern, there's 2 reasons why we focus on the West. One is because we have blinders and we don't get the opportunity to speak to people from the Global South as much as is appropriate. The other is, I think this is a descriptive feature of the world circa 2000. I think the world looks really different in 2020. I think even the term Global South is an interesting one, given kind of the rise of kind of the term BRICS. So at some point we thought, and circa 2020, that there were these middle income, Brazil, Russia, India, and so forth, were in the same category as China. And now we think China is in a league of its own. And it doesn't make sense of thinking of the North-South distinction the same way, given the rise of China economically and the efforts China has made to formalize networks, to build connections with so many states in Asia and Africa. So yes, the paper is focused on the West. Yes, it is based on this optimism kind of after the fall of the Berlin Wall between 1990 and 2000, when we thought like there's going to be like a single world, every country is going to be a democracy, every country will be part of the same universe of states. So that there was a lot of optimism at the time these were established. That doesn't quite seem justified today. Now, are there networks? What's happening in Asia? What's happening in Africa? What's happening in the Americas? There are many, I would say, formal international organizations are on the rise here as well. So there are efforts led by China, which I don't fully understand, and which my co-author Christina Dargadas is studying, to say, like, look, there is a competing system. There is a system of authoritarian international law that is nascent. And what it looks like is very similar to traditional international organizations. I am not a China law expert by any means, but Xi just gave his very big speech, and he said, we are against Western imperialism and we are against protectionism. So the idea that you would want free markets for manufactured goods was a mantle that the West had picked up when the West was manufacturing, and now China has picked up when that is essential. So it's fascinating to see kind of the shift in the center of gravity and economic power, but also some of the same forms persist. But you're absolutely right that this is a paper about networks led by the West.
Thank you for that answer. Now, the next question that we have is on potential legal liabilities. So we know that if it comes to traditional international institutions, they would be immune from legal claims in most jurisdictions. So what about the liability for anything done by these network-like international institutions? Do you have any thoughts or any examples on that? Thank you.
Absolutely. So kind of the architects of some of these networks and so on said, like, maybe this isn't so important or maybe it is important. So I'll speak about two funds. I'll speak about the health fund, so the global fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, and I'll speak about some funds that were modeled on that to fight climate change. So if you're going to have a lot of money to fight these diseases, there's a question of, like, are you potential tort liability in the country where you are distributing the vaccine could be huge. Something goes wrong with a vaccine, something goes wrong with a health campaign, and all of the money that's supposed to go to vaccination around the world, in fact, goes to compensate tort victims. If you were an international organization like the UN, you could just say, I'm so sorry, we have no legal liability. We're happy to give you a statement of apology, or we're happy to give you a small amount of money. This is kind of the UN's response to Haiti. So if you're trying to shield those assets, what can you do? You can try to do it country by country. So you can try to get protection for the assets of designed for climate change, and that's an effort that's happening, but that's very, very slow. The other thing you can do is try to park your money with the World Bank. So that's kind of what the Global Fund has done. They said, like, look, we'll try to get some immunity under Swiss law, but because we're not sure that a court in Madagascar would find us immune, because we will then put our money somewhere where it's going to be really hard for them to access should there be claimants. But these workarounds are not watertight. We don't really know. We haven't had those claims yet. And we haven't seen immunities for the organizations and their actions the way there's been a fix when it comes to staff, where the staff of the networks formally become staff of another international organization, and that addresses the immunity issues for claims against staff.
Thank you for that excellent answer. Now, if I may build up on that question from one of our TAs, Mashroor Jawad. So do you have any, I know you have covered it in your presentation, but I was wondering, in a Rohingya refugee-like situation, what kind of institutions have a greater role? Do you see a greater role for diplomacy or network-based institutions, or for the UNHCR or similar traditional international institutions? Or maybe what about Bangladesh's options? If Bangladesh has to do something on this, which options could or it should pursue? Thank you.
So I would love to hear more about your views on this, but my sense, in some work I've done with Helena Chachko on sharing responsibility for refugees, is that basically what Bangladesh should do, if I were advising the Bangladeshi government, it would be to look at what Turkey did, which is saying, like, hey, we are hosting 4 million Syrians. Give us this amount of money immediately and we will do a much better job. So Turkey was able to do this in part by implicitly threatening, like, hey, we will just open the borders if you don't give us the money. But I think, and like, this will be Europe's problem, and the Europeans complied with very large aid packages per refugee. We have the exact numbers and the estimates in our paper. But I think I think Bangladesh should not be hosting this number of refugees without very significant monetary support from the rest of the world. So that's kind of my bottom line. Now, people working in this sphere say there should be different solutions kind of in the medium term. So it's totally incorrect that we have a right, we have no right for refugees to travel to other countries, but we do have an obligation on the neighboring state not to turn them away, right? So this is going to put huge obligations on 5 countries in the developing world. So it's not even on all of the developing world. So the obligations are concentrated very disproportionately on Bangladesh, on Turkey, on, again, kind of Rwanda is getting very good deals, is my sense. These deals are secret. These deals are widely criticized by refugee advocates who say, no, like everyone should just go to live in a really rich Western countries, and really rich Western countries are never going to say yes to that. But my sense is that seeking greater financial support is very much on the table. There's some other reasons. So there's the Ukraine example, the Venezuela example, the Syria example that I think are well worth looking into. So the world is not paying attention to the Rohingya crisis. I think that's absolutely correct. UNHCR and aid organizations are, in my view, doing important work, but I would love to hear what the concerns are. I think in any community that faces a very large influx of refugees suddenly, xenophobia rises. I think it is seen as widely unfair that resources go to the minority and in a community that's developing. So I think that is absolutely the case kind of globally, and I suspect it is the case in Bangladesh. What has happened more recently? So in 2018, well, with the Syrian refugee crisis, Europe worried that millions more Syrians would come to Europe and signed a widely criticized deal with Turkey's leader Erdogan, in which Erdogan would receive a lot of money per refugee and close the border. Now, nobody advocates for this deal in public. People think this is terrible. I think it has many advantages. One of the advantages is that Turkey is better compensated for a huge responsibility. I mean, Erdogan, I'm from Greece, so I do not like Erdogan, but I do think that he tried very actively initially to minimize xenophobia, to say, we're not Turks and Arabs, we are Muslim brothers. I think there was some comfort there. I think, the cleavages that come up were smaller than they could have been, in part because of all of this European money. I think that the Europeans treated the Ukrainians very, very differently and just said, just come in. You don't need to apply for asylum. You will have legal status and work permit. You can work. It's a different story that I don't think they will necessarily repeat for other groups. I think the US is working very closely with Colombia to handle the Venezuelan crisis right now. So that's another model. So Venezuela is collapsing economically. We could have said these are not refugees, they're socioeconomic migrants. That's not what we're saying. We are taking in here in the US some, and we are contributing very significantly to Colombia's budget. And I think there is some literature that suggests that people fleeing their country don't want to move somewhere very far. They want to be in a society that is close to their home country. They want the opportunity to return. So I think an argument can be made that these monetary transfers, even though they also make it life much, much easier for Western countries than actually hosting refugees, might also be in the interest of displaced people themselves. So I am a minority voice in thinking that you must, the goal should be massive monetary transfers on the kind of scale that Erdogan got and that Colombia is getting right now. And that's the solution for Bangladesh. I don't know I'd love to hear a little bit more on what your view is on what the Rohingya situation looks like on the ground right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. If I may share my thoughts on that, as you have invited me to, I would imagine that I mostly agree with you. And with regard to the Turkey's example that you have just cited, I would just say that it also depends on who your neighbors are. and what are the cards on your hand? So I guess our diplomats could share more on that. I'm not in any way in a position to state our official positions, but some of the criticisms that our diplomats have coped or our politicians have for not moving to the ICJ, I don't think that really was an option on the card, because the way we have ratified the Genocide Convention, I don't think we could actually bring a claim against Myanmar. Maybe the only real thing that I have some disagreement with the policy, because it seemed to me that somehow we believed, or at least we projected, our position in a way that it was possible for us to get something from Myanmar, although Myanmar regime's tactics was actually quite evident from the beginning that they were just bidding for time. They were not really serious in doing anything meaningful. So I'll just put it that way. The next question that I would like to ask is on the real drive for these institutions that, or networks, I should say. Do you think, is it more about coalition of the willing, or sort of a desire for an exclusionary club, exclusive club, or was it other things, the nimbleness and other benefits? I know this is not perhaps a question on which you can say for sure, because it's a matter of conjecture, but I know you have conducted many interviews. So do you have any thought on that? Thank you.
Yes. So one of the most fun parts of this project were conducting interviews with high-level diplomats, some of them kind of completely off the record, some of them completely on the record, and everything in between, including leaders on the EU and the US side who were key participants in the negotiations. I think my understanding is that the motives were mixed. I think exclusion was certainly part of the motivation. I think there's an early round of literature that documents this quite clearly, and it doesn't, I don't know that people would come out and say it, but I think saying like, look, we go to the UN and it's a talking shop and people make all of these speeches, and every year we fight over the budget and the cleavages are the same. We want to pay, we the West, the net contributors want to pay less. The net recipients want to pay more. We want to give earmarked funds to fund like specific countries and specific projects we support. The UN Secretariat, likes money, but they really want the general budgets to, fund the priorities that they want, that they deem important. They find that earmarked money is sometimes hard to use. So these cleavages have been going on for decades. I don't think there's much new there. I think it's well recognized. I do think there is a sense and an optimism about how corporations are run, and whether you would want corporations involved and whether you would want a corporate model. So I think we have some quote in the paper saying like, look, a Coca-Cola does not have a board of 190, because with a board of 190, you cannot make decisions. It's no wonder that you have all of this deadlock at the UN. You need proactive decision makers. I think that's right there. I think just as power has moved from West to East, so power has moved away from states and to corporations. So the idea that you don't need to bring in pharmaceutical companies to deal with a health emergency was belied by COVID. The idea that like you really needed to come up with new contracts, new mechanisms, money would come from states, technology would come from pharmaceuticals. You needed to do this in no time. So you needed good relationships rather than conflict. And the WHO, rightly, I think, is very, very skeptical of the influence of pharmaceutical companies, but kind of some of these new associations said, no, you need the corporate sector. Where the money will come from, the vast inequality we have in some Western states means that Gates or Buffett or Bezos just have these huge foundations. So being able to tap into those resources as well seemed kind of important in the priority. Staffing the organizations differently was also kind of a big concern. So when the UN was founded in 1945. There was a debate on who the staff would be. The West said, let's have a meritocracy. And the Global South said, no, if we have meritocratic criteria, like nobody is going to pass the exams from our states. It's all going to be staffed by Westerners. This concern is still kind of a really big one. So UNDP says we're different from the rest of the UN in that we hire local staff, and we think we're much more effective for that reason. So I think these are all kind of long-standing concerns, and I think the true answer for kind of what the promise of networks was and why it didn't quite deliver has to do with, excluding, has to do with efficiency, has to do with generally wanting to solve some problems quickly. So I'll just end with this time inconsistency problem. If you want to solve a problem immediately, you don't bring in a team, you don't set up an organizational structure, you just do it in an ad hoc way. And I think that's part of the appeal. But then kind of knowing what we do, that these organizations, are initially thought up as temporary, but end up having really long histories, is maybe a reason for pause, a reason to say, well, let's structure it properly. Let's make sure we have all of the protections we need, all of the structures we need, because it's not a fire that we will put out. It's going to be a series of fires over the decades. I've been fascinated to read how the UNHCR was set up, and it was set up as like, look, this is a one-time problem. We had the Nazis, they created a refugee situation in Europe. We're never going to have refugees again in any part of the world. Those were kind of some of the statements. In 1948, the legal counsel, they were like, this is a temporary one-off problem. And obviously it has not turned out to be a problem that is one-off or limited to Europe or the Nazis. So I think thinking with a medium to long-term time horizon can pay off.
Thank you, Professor Linos, for that answer. Thank you once again for your excellent lecture. Have a good day.
Thank you.